technical issues are out of the way. Okay, so these were two issues that I ran into when I was developing the app that I was working on. And again, take the year out of it, because I think that the year doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. It's more like, I think that the ways of the past with apps, maybe people didn't have kind of a formal sort of standard for how things should work. Like, you know, I mean, a lot of the time apps were kind of talking to like a RESTful API, which is great because it follows a known standard that you can sort of stick to, but the functionality when you're syncing a client-side database to a server isn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily match what a RESTful API might offer. And by all means, like, it doesn't mean that you should abandon the RESTful standard for doing an API, but it is sort of a challenge to get the optimization in line with what you expect the client to be doing. And so these two topics go together pretty well, because the functionality that I was implementing with the modular table views sort of brought me to the challenge of building this offline API syncing system that would then take that data and submit it to the server, or sync it to the server in a way that made sense. So yeah, so let me get into it, and we'll go from there. So when building table views, as you were saying with the protocol stuff, things can get out of control quick. So since everyone's familiar with settings.app on iOS, I wanted to use this as an example initially, because if you were building something like this, it could get to be a huge view controller really quickly. You know, you have to think about, this isn't just a few sections. Like, there's a lot of dynamic rows that are being inserted and deleted based on whether certain features are enabled or disabled, or available or not available. Like, for example, if you turn on airplane mode, it might take out a bunch of the rows having to do with radio stuff. Having certain applications installed will add sections or remove sections from the app settings part. And as anyone knows who's worked with table views, I mean, this can cause a lot of crashes and stuff if your code isn't just totally in line. And that's kind of a problem, because there's just a lot of edge cases that you might not think of when you're building the code. So, oh, and the massive view controller thing is a big problem. So the problem, as I said, is that, you know, from the get-go, even with a really simple view controller, you have this like protocol of just integer handling and index path handling that just could be much cleaner and nicer in 2016. So that's kind of where the year stuff came from. But yeah, and then the crashes, of course. So my story is that I was working on this app called Cafe Wi-Fi, and it's a very table viewy app where, like, I wanted to just make it like a very kind of native feeling. Like, if Apple were to build something for this, maybe it would be something similar to this design. So just like standard table view is very similar to settings.app, where, you know, there's lots of rows and they're changing, and there's lots of things that are shared GUI wise throughout the thing. And then, you know, there's a lot of stuff moving around. I think as Matt said, like, I think I'm kind of pushing table view to the limit of what it can do, or what it should be used to do. You know, and there's just like, there's a lot going on at once. And, you know, if I hadn't kind of been able to break this down, I think that it would have been not only unstable, but just impossible to maintain. Like, if I went back to edit the code, I would have been like, what is going on? Spaghetti mess. So that's not good. I can show you guys a quick demo of kind of all that's going on here. These are all table views. That's actually a stack view wrapped around a table view at the bottom. So this is a collection view actually, but yeah, so like there's all these things going on in a single view controller where you can add attributes and zones to cafes or co-working spaces and stuff, and say, I sped this up on purpose, but you can say kind of like where stuff is, and, you know, so like this is just like trying to maintain this would have been just a nightmare without kind of breaking this down somehow, especially since there's all these parts that are reused throughout the application. Like, I mean, it's not just the cells, there's like specific sections of cells that wouldn't make sense to code more than once. So yeah, it's pretty daunting to build something like this. So there's some engineering required. It's possible to modularize stuff with TableView, but it's not very straightforward. So, and yeah, of course, Apple hasn't made TableView sections into objects yet. Maybe they will, but I think there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, and of course, like I said, not modularizing leads to more bugs. Instagram also had this problem. They're using collection view, and they released a library recently called IGListKit. Very similar approach to what I did, but this is for collection view, and they open source this, which is great. But similar thing where they're just like, why isn't there a way to break stuff down? And as you can see from their map, I mean, you kind of point what you're displaying, the Instagram feed or something like that, at this adapter, which then has sections of cells and things like that. So I think that based on what I've heard from a few people, there have been some solutions to this problem that have not been released to the public, maybe because, just nobody bit the bullet and did it. But finally Instagram was like, okay, we're gonna take what we built internally and make it publicly available. But yeah, what about UITableView? So I released something, and I'm gonna talk about the design challenges, and then I'll talk about what that is. So of all the things I mentioned here, you have to account for a bunch of things. One is disappearing sections, subsections, toggleable sections, and subsections are another. Then if you have core data going into this, like if you've ever used the magic NS fetch results controller, you probably don't want to move away from that if you can avoid it. So because that takes a lot of the work out of doing some of this stuff too. So there's a lot to go into this, and trying to fit that all into one thing, I ended up with something called BG, which are my initials, Recursive Table View Data Source. And this was the most lightweight solution I could come up with to do what I wanted to do, and I've made this open source. It does modularized section groups, so not individual sections, but you can do one or more sections as an object, and this is key. This cleaned up my code considerably, and it allows subclassing of sections, let's just say section groups. The subclassing of section groups, so you can reuse parts of your table views anywhere in your applications, call methods on them, and it makes debugging, toggling stuff way easier, because you can, if you're having a crash, like you can pinpoint exactly which section group that is coming from, and just turn that off and make sure everything works, and then debug that individual part of a potentially very complex table view. This is a map of how it works. This looks really weird, but I can tell you that this is pretty much exactly the same as what the Instagram thing is for collection view, but for this, the big difference is that, as the name implies, this is recursive. So the reason for that is because you want to be able to put another section group within a section group so that you can toggle with a switch, like rows appearing and disappearing. Normally, I don't think you would need that functionality for anything else. But if you want to make a section group appear within a section group, that is a possibility. And the way that that works is you just pin it to a row in another thing, but I'll show how that works in a second. So it has support for NS fetch results controller, if you want that, which many of us do. And then you can basically just stack existing UITableView data sources that you've written just generically in kind of one big table view. And so it's a familiar protocol. It basically just implements that same protocol as a group of sections within a parent sort of section, or a parent data source, that it abstracts all that away from you, so you don't have to rewrite the same code over and over again. And the projector just cut out. Don't do this to me. Okay. So that doesn't happen again. So this is just like a GIF demo of this. Like, I mean, this is, you've all seen this stuff before, but this is it doing it in just a basic sample application that I did. This was all really easy to do. I'm going to show the code for this in 1 second, but these are just basically table view data sources within a table view data source. So this is Objective-C code, I apologize, but just to show you the scale of the code, this is a section group. It's basically just a UITableView data source. And what you would do is, So like the only thing here that's different from a UITableView data source is that you'd call super on the number of sections and the number of rows in the section, and that in case another another section group has embedded that one like recursively, it will then tell you the total number of rows for that. Or I'm sorry, if there's another section group within that section group, it will add those in using the super methods or the super calls. So this is the data source. So like this is just basically the ones that you want. The existing section groups kind of just initialized and clumped together. And you can also adjust this at runtime, so you can dynamically insert and remove section groups, which I do. And then the view controller is super simple. You just point to the data source, which has all the section groups in it. And then for the delegate methods, like if you want to do like did select row at index path, you call on the data source the index path of the outer sort of table view, and then it will have this. It has this method called resolve section group and inner index path for the top level index path, which does exactly what it sounds like, and it gives you a match block, which provides the section group and inner index path of that data source. So it's literally stacking data sources, which is pretty sweet. Oh, and you can return stuff through that. It's pretty awesome. So this is all in the sample project. This is just how you do like a switch section group. So it's the same as the other thing, but you pin, like I can explain this. So you pin another section group to an index path within that section group. So it's not like you're pinning it to the outer section group or the outer index path. You see like all these section index paths and stuff, but like you'd pin it to the index path of that section group, which then translates automatically to the top level. So it takes all that guesswork out, depending on whether it's the fifth section or the first section. And then you have a switch that then triggers this method, which inserts or removes the section group at non-subsection index path based on whether or not the switch is active. So, I mean, I can't think of a simpler way to do that. If you can, tell me. So that's part one. You can find this at my GitHub. And I think that it's the kind of thing where, like, unless you're starting an application from scratch, you probably wouldn't use it. But if you are starting an application from scratch that you think that, or a part of an application from scratch that you think could benefit from this, I really think that you should check it out. Because if you're trying to do anything like what I was trying to do, like, just don't bother. Like, just start with something that takes all that away, because you're gonna just write so much code that you don't want to write. Any questions so far about this?
Yeah, why Objective-C?
Oh, I mean, so the reason why so my App Cafe Wi-Fi is still written in Objective-C mostly because I was going to use Swift, but Swift, when I started that project, was still kind of in a gray area of like what was actually happening, I guess. And I think it was a good decision to use Objective-C because of all the changes that have happened with Swift 3 and the kind of lack of bandwidth that I have for going back and rewriting stuff. But it doesn't really make a significant difference, I think. But I didn't have to change any code recently, so I guess that does make a difference. But going forward, I mean, I think that maybe less developers could help because they don't know Objective-C. But at least I didn't write in like C++, like Objective-C++ or something. So yeah, but the example project, if anybody wants to convert it to Swift, that'd be awesome. Or at least have a Swift copy of it, because I mean, some people can't read Objective-C code. But yeah, of course this works in Swift. So anyways, I can move on to stage, or part 2 of this.
No.
So,
I
you have one? Okay.
Not exactly. I like your idea about it.
Yeah.
Putting a subsection into a section.
Mm-hmm.
But just regarding your application, the cafe Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Did you have any idea to avoid such a complicated UI by design from a simple UI or UX to avoid using such a complicated solution? I mean, I haven't looked into your code, but
yeah.
Just based on your idea, a section into a subsection in a section,
yeah.
And doing the animation or phase it out or in like the setting application is complicated. as we both agree, and
Yeah.
most of us agree, the setting application is not a simple application.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
But for your purpose, for your application, I mean, maybe you can choose a much more simpler solution. Just making some changes in your UI or UX, make the data more fluid, or introduce a few more steps. I don't know, whatever.
I'll play devil's advocate just for fun. I could also imagine a scenario where you are simplifying it by saying, if I toggle this off, I now remove these 15 things from your UI. You don't even have to think about them. In
Yeah.
which case, that's sort of the use case he's looking at.
Yeah.
But he's also adding stuff based on steps, right?
Based on the
not,
saying,
not,
I
not just
need one.
removing stuff, right?
Yeah, it's like saying, on the other hand, if you happen to be someone who needs these extra settings, like you're an advanced user, you toggle the switch, here's all this extra stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, there's-
in that scenario, I agree. This solution is wonderful. If you have such kind of a requirement, my question is not regarding your solution to the
Yeah.
to this section. Just
I mean, to tell you the truth, there's like a million different ways to design stuff. I mean, ask a designer like Alex. But so what I didn't show you about this attribute editor for places is that there's a lot of different things you can edit on there. Like you can say this place requires a membership between these times of the day and it costs this much. And doing that sort of modularity, I mean, it's basically a full-blown JSON editor. Like it edits just JSON data and displays it based on what's there, packed into sort of a template of things that I've prescribed. And to do that sort of complexity, like the modularity of that I couldn't think of a better way to do it than with table views. I mean, obviously if I go in and just tag one attribute, then, whatever, but like, it's hard for people to find those options if they don't see them, because I mean, if I'm gonna hide all that stuff away and make it like one button, then you don't know kind of the extent and complexity of the app. But it's kind of that fine line and balance of where you don't want to overcomplicate stuff, and maybe, I mean, I'm sure there's a different way I could have done it, but
Yeah, I
If
see.
it's good, because like the disappearing section is always annoying, just like you said. But like when I do consulting, when people come to me, they always ask for it, and then I agree with you. It's a lot of data, and it always gets more complicated than it needs to be. I
Yeah,
think
sure.
this is a good start though, because I was doing a lot of manual tracking, and then I'd have to like manually look at the cell and maybe look at the data source itself
Yeah.
to be like, oh, well, this is still valid data, but this isn't still.
yeah, it becomes a disaster, like when you're doing any sort of table view stuff that's dynamic. So whatever. I mean, like I said, this was the most lightweight solution that I could come up with, and this is like battle tested in my app. Like, I mean, I've fixed like every bug I could possibly find, and there's tests in this too. So like, if anybody wants to throw stuff in and it breaks one of the tests, like, be my guest.
Yeah, cool.
We'll see.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, what do I do with all the data coming from this attribute editor? As I mentioned, like this is editing JSON, and it's creating objects and core data on the local device, and submitting these to the server isn't straightforward for a number of reasons. So, the objective C is to build a syncing offline capable app. Not what I'm doing. A simple example is like, if you think about a guest book, this is not an offline app. It just makes a single HTTP post request or something else. And then, if there's an error, which happens a lot with bad connectivity, especially Wi-Fi, you can present the error message allowing, a retry or cancel. It's not that complicated. Like, you don't have to plan for many sort of scenarios. But, with my app, there's a lot of different buttons you can press. There's different actions, like you can add a photo, or maybe you did a Wi-Fi speed test, and like a lot of this stuff doesn't require user interaction, and it also shouldn't. Like, for example, if there's a failure when somebody hits the button to vote on something, or like to rate something, like I don't need to say like, hey, this failed. Like, here's a blocking error message. Do you want to retry or cancel? Like that just doesn't make any sense. So on the other hand, if I'm on an airplane or if I have bad connectivity and I'm starting to do a bunch of different things, I don't need to create like 8 different HTTP requests unless that's like the only way to do it with the API. I can probably batch those into a single request. So, what's the real issue here? Well, the data structure of your data can cause a big problem with RESTful APIs. So if I start batching stuff together and they're dependent on a single parent, that's not going to work very well. So considering the RESTful structure, so post request to create a place, like let's say I'm doing this all at the same time. Post request to vote on something, post request to create an attribute. What if I just created 8 attributes and then for some reason the first request failed or something like that? Like it just creates this mess of HTTP requests that maybe don't work. Like this seems suboptimal. Like what's going on? So even further, like an app has multiple users making asynchronous requests from multiple locations, and potentially they're working on the same data. There's many possible states of data between the client and the server, and there could be errors that, like let's say like somebody did a device migration, like they restored from a backup, and I don't know why my Wi-Fi isn't there. Oh, sorry. So like somebody could have done a device migration where they restored from a backup, or they, anything could be possible here. And so like thinking about all this stuff and all the possible situations, like what do you do, right? Then it gets even more complicated because if there's a level 2 child or even level 10 or something like that, where this depends on that, and then you're creating all this stuff in this sort of recursive way, like, what do you do with these post requests, right? So let's say this failed, like I said, then these are going to fail. And so all the subsequent queued requests are still queued in whatever structure you're using. And this whole thing breaks down in these sort of edge case scenarios. Then if you get HTTP2 involved, all this stuff gets queued up to the server, which you then can't modify because it's doing this for efficiency purposes. So it might queue up a bunch of requests, which are then processed in the order which they are sent, but you lose control of those because they've already been sent to the server, and if one failed, then they all fail. So this problem just gets worse and worse and worse unless you figure it out, because you can't cancel or adjust the requests after they've already been sent. So how often do things actually fail? Well, not that often if your API is stable, but there is kind of one situation that I run into fairly often, which is deduplication. So let's say, for example, somebody did the device migration and their data is out of date on the device, or another user's worked on an object or created an object, and so it hits a duplicate request. In order to deduplicate that, you need to bundle enough information about the first object's request with that other subsequent request in order for it to sufficiently deduplicate it. Because if, for example, that's already been created, then you need to be like, okay, well, wherever this object for this data is, which you're then submitting all the data again, enough to deduplicate it, it needs to then handle that correctly. So this doesn't work, this isn't efficient at all, because you're basically uploading again and again and again on every single level of API requests that are all happening, kind of in this more efficient or this RESTful structure that's split out in that way. Has anybody run into this, just out of curiosity, or am I just like losing everyone in outer space here? No? You? One person, hell yeah. You've had this before? Okay, that's good, because I kind of I was hoping that this would turn into a bit of a discussion. So, well, let me finish up here and we'll talk about it. So the solution that I came up with is just roll your own batching. You can still use the RESTful structure, and you probably should, but when you're sending data to the server, send all of the data that you can and let the server work it out. So since this is not a server-side talk, I'm not going to get into the details of that, this is more of a server-side issue. It's very challenging to solve on server-side, but if you limit the number of objects you can send maybe 10 in one request, and then it'll just process them all in the order in which it prefers. And to be honest, I don't think that there's any way for the client to know what the server should be doing unless you're 100% sure. So this is probably what you should be doing anyway if you're syncing a lot of data. But yeah, there's a couple things you do have to watch out for. One, of course, is what I said, limit the number of objects you send. But two is that you have to prioritize what you want to send, because the server at some point might say like, okay, you sent too many. Like if you send 1 million objects, it's going to rate limit that and say like, no. So you need to send like the most important ones first, and that kind of becomes a little bit more of a client-side logic issue. One example I can give you is that for my app, if you're uploading a photo, that usually runs as its own request, like with no other bundled objects, unless there's a dependency that it needs, like it'll fail without it, because that's so bandwidth intensive. But little things like votes or attributes, like those are just like super quick. So like you can bundle hundreds of those together and it'll just crank through them. So one implementation of this is to, and this is the simplest one I could come up with just for the slides. You assign a client-side unique identifier, with NSUID. So it's unique for that object that you're submitting. Bundle a bunch of them together, and then submit it to the server, and then receive a response back with the object statuses, like whether or not they were accepted, and any new identifiers from the server. I can tell you that it's possible to recycle the client-side unique identifier globally if it is unique to every device, but NSUID is only guaranteed to be unique for that device, and it's possible for another device to come up with that same UUID. So generally the server has to check to make sure it's actually unique. So keep that in mind. That's where things get a little bit complicated. So just some example JSON for this. Like, I mean, if you're submitting a bunch of stuff together, you could put a bunch of these, but you'd say like, the local identifier that device came up with. If this is not a new object, then you already know the identifier from the server. You can include one or both of the two identifiers. The actual object data in a separate kind of sub-JSON object, and then any parents. You can list off multiple parents. It's possible to have multiple parents, which is another tricky thing. And if you have to make sure that both of those exist, like doing that in separate REST requests is a little bit tricky. So that's where stuff like this really starts to rock, because this would be just so complicated otherwise, but like you can just put the two parents in there and it'll just take care of all of it. So some alternatives to this if you don't want to code this yourself. Firebase, Realm, CloudKit. I've never used CloudKit. Has anybody used CloudKit? No? Me too. And like the fact that it's not, I don't think it's cross-platform, is it? Does it work on Android?
No, I think it has REST APIs.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's one of those things where like maybe they'll just sunset it at some point if it's not popular enough, and I don't know if I'd use that. But for Realm, where this is like their entire business, where they're moving into it, I'm sure that they've figured a lot of this stuff out. And I mean, I think Matt was saying that like they were doing a demo at another event where it was like really impressive. So if you're comfortable using Realm or Firebase or something like that, like that'll just do all this stuff for you, I'm sure. But just keep in mind, obviously, that migrating off of that or doing hard optimizations where like you can't get past a certain bug or whatever.
We actually stumbled across the same problem. We were using Parse.
Yeah.
And we migrated from Parse to our own servers. That was so messed up.
It's a pain, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's good because if you just want to get an app out quick to see if anybody's going to use it, like that's definitely the best way to do it. But then if you don't carefully plan around like your migrations, then you can run into problems, because when do you migrate? It's like a huge undertaking. You might be building your app from scratch almost just to get these kind of situations sorted out. But I mean, depending on what you're doing, I mean, if it's just kind of a hobby app, like who cares, right? If it becomes annoying, just like shut it down or something, I don't know. So yeah, the take-homes of both things, of course, are always to modularize and optimize, because otherwise the code can just be unmaintainable. I mean, it's just spread out. Like you gotta have like these little like bite-sized pieces so that if you go back to it, you can just read the whole thing because it's so small and to the point. I'm sure a lot of you guys are already doing that, but I mean, you'd be surprised. Some people have these really long functions. Try to reuse a lot of the code so you minimize individual instances of bugs and therefore the resulting necessary QA. Part of the reason why I built the TableView thing was so that if I fixed something one place, it was fixed everywhere. And this is a big one. Like, with the syncing stuff, it might seem like a real pain, but just remember that every single operation you do has to have a GUI retry button anyway. So you're doing all this extra GUI work to make these operations retryable. And you know, if you could just streamline the whole thing and make it easy for your users and you, like that seems to make sense. Plus, if it works offline, that's good. You're basically just caching or building up a cache of like a bunch of requests that when it can. I mean, for my app, you know, a lot of these people are running around in like areas with really bad 3G, or like, you know, I was in Vietnam like a couple of weeks ago, and like my internet was cutting out all the time, but I was still able to use my app, and then it would just sync all the changes when it had connectivity. So these are real problems that exist, you know, outside of Japan, where like there's fast LTE everywhere. You know, just think about that. And so, you know, and yeah, pick and choose your battles, of course. Like, I mean, there's no point in, you know, if you can use one of these, like, don't bother with this stuff, because there's always going to be stuff that they've thought of that you haven't thought of yet. My guess that that's true, but like, yeah, if you do have to do any coding like that, like, you know, especially with the TableView data source stuff, like, if you're going with a crazy TableView layout, just try to modularize it and reduce all the bugs and use my library or something else. I don't think anything else exists, but I'd love feedback on this. If you can send me issues or thoughts or suggestions, let me know. My app's available at my website, cafewifi.com, and thanks. So that's it.